Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Nash, AAPG, and I'm thrilled to be able to introduce you to what could be a new topic for you as Orphan Wells and also the different funding sources that are available today for identifying and cleaning up orphaned and abandoned wells. So we'll learn all about what's happening right now, and we'll have some updates too from people who participated, helped organize the incredible conference that we had in Oklahoma City in February. So I just wanted to mention that this is a production of AAPG, and also we are co-sponsoring it with Desk and Derrick of Tulsa. And I'm excited about Desk and Derrick. It's kind of like what engineers and geologists are in the same boat as many others, that you don't really do geology, but you do a lot of the process pieces in the operations. And that's what a lot of what Desk and Derrick does. So I'm really excited to be able to welcome them. And see, Gabe Wheeler, she might put contact information in the chat for joining Desk and Derrick. And also like to encourage people to join AAPG. And just like to mention that at our annual convention, we will have an entire session on Orphan Wells, and then also continuing activities. So what I'd like to do is just let you know that we have a packed program today. We'll have Dan Arthur of ALL Consulting, Mileva Radonjic of OSU, and then we have Andrew Govert of the DOE, Department of Energy, and Scott St. John of Red Dirt Energy. And they will do brief introductions to just let you know what they're doing in the Orphan Well side of things. And our main presenters will be Curtis Shuck of the Well Done Foundation and Dwayne Purvis, a professional engineer. And they will be talking about the actual operations of Orphan Wells. So anyway, I'd like to invite Dan to share his screen and to get started.
Well, I don't have any presentations for this today.
That's
Susan,
fine.
I don't really have anything to share. So can you see me, I assume?
Yes, we can see you.
Well, then I'll keep going. So I'll just say that, you know, in the orphan well world, things are moving fast. So it reminds me of a lot of past things in the oil and gas and environmental industries and more. But what I will say is this is an incredible opportunity, and an incredible opportunity not only for people to do neat things, but for us to help the environment, for us to also find some hidden treasures. So just this morning, I've had 3 calls with individuals looking to repurpose wells for items like geothermal energy, lithium production, iodine production, and also looking at history and historical development practices to see if there's opportunities to put some of these old wells on back on production. So there really are some big things. And I'll tell you, the other thing I think that probably everyone that's getting involved in this is having to deal some with is well locations and details and records and so forth. So, you know, trying to find all this old information is an incredible task. But fortunately, we've had, you know, the AAPG get involved, SPE. There's an upcoming later this summer, Image for Geosciences is doing a workshop on orphan wells. I'll be involved with that. But there's many that are coming along. The federal government funding from states, as well as the private sector taking an active role in this. There's a lot going on and a lot to be done. And what I'm hoping that we do is not bypass things in this incredible opportunity we have. So we need to be looking at plugging wells so that we do eliminate emissions of natural gas. We need to make sure that we plug them right so that they don't pop up later when we want to do a water flood or a CO2 flood or some geothermal project. We want to make sure that we address, groundwater, soil contamination, because this is our chance, and that we don't leave wells behind. So one of the things I've really been pushing is that we look at wells on an area basis in addition to just a single well basis, because oftentimes we come in and plug one well and there's 10 other ones there that get unaddressed. So it's a great opportunity that we're bringing all these people together, all these great minds, and a lot of people that are really trying to do good things. So hopefully everyone recognizes the tremendous opportunity we have here. So Susan, with that, that's I'll pass the baton.
Okay, well, thank you, Dan. That's great. And really appreciate it. Mileva, would you like, Dr. Radonjic, would you like to speak now?
So like Dan, I think, since this is just a short introduction, I am not really going to have any slides, but I'm going to basically pick up from where Dan left. I agree that it is a tremendous opportunity. I personally have been looking at leaky wells since 2003, and in those days, it wasn't a really hot topic for either research or for funding. It was brought to attention primarily because of CO2 storage. It was one of the key risks that was associated with that new technology. But as Dan eloquently pointed out, this is a really great opportunity because these orphan wells are bringing to the forefront the problem that we have with wellbore integrity and wellbore leakage. And I would expand and say this is not only an issue for orphan wells. Many of the active wells are also, problematic. Many of the wells that are abandoned. So I believe that in one area, once we identify and locate and decide on whether it's a regional or individual campaign of P&A on these wells, we do need to have a good technology how to actually provide a long-lasting sealing materials. So my focus is really in that area. And traditionally, when we drill and complete wells, we really want them to last, a few decades at the most. But now we are asking the same materials to be able to provide the sealing over hundreds or thousands of years. If we kind of get into geological time, it's even longer. And so there is a huge need for advancement in the materials area for wellbore construction, abandonment. All of that really is actually, going in the same direction. And I believe not only will we contribute hugely to the issue of orphan wells if we nail this and get it right. We will also have technologies that can be implemented in geothermal wells, that can be implemented in all these horizontal fracked wells that we have across the country. They too have issues. So overall, I think there will be these barrier materials and sealing materials that can be even transferred to other applications like seawalling and other issues that we have when it comes to low permeability materials. So that's really all that I wanted to pitch today, Susan. Thank you for yet another successful webinar.
Well, thank you so much, Mileva. Really appreciate it. So let's move to Andrew Govert, and welcome, Andrew.
Yes, thank you. So as Susan already pointed out, so I'm representing the Undocumented Orphan Wells program of the Department of Energy. So we are, I would say, adjacent to what a lot of this conversation is, because a lot of it's about the the known orphan wells, and that's being handled by the Department of Interior. But the thing we're challenged with looking for is identifying the undocumented wells. So all these holes that, especially that were drilled in the early part of this last century and maybe even before then, that didn't get recorded for whatever reason. And then of course, ones that just happen to fall off the database list, etc. And I'll parrot Dan is that things are moving fast. And so there's lots of opportunity in this space. I think this list that we're working on building will eventually migrate over into the orphan list to eventually be addressed in some form of plugging or remediation form. And so there's a lot of interest in technologies that we can leverage to further identify these wells. Things that have been actively or going on since the meeting in March. One thing is we're actively working with groups like Curtis at the Well Done Foundation to better understand, how these wells leak and methane monitoring techniques and measurements. And we're working with him and the DOI to help give better guidelines on how to get, cost-effective measurements for these wells, depending on the type of, the rates of emission coming off of them. We're also, another two areas that will be standing up pretty soon was, one, we'll have our website up fairly shortly, but we are working on a national wells database. So I'm hoping to have it, up and published in the next month or so, where we will be pulling from as many different sources as we possibly can to highlight where these, where there's data about wells. This will include both, mostly the states, but other sources as well. And so one thing I would, put out there is, if you guys know of other databases that you think we need to be aware of or could possibly be mining, I would encourage you to reach out to us so that we can include it. Same thing with data extraction. So in fact, I just got off a meeting where we're looking at leveraging things like Chat GPT to help extract data from well completion reports of different genres in order to help get us more information to fill in those well headers, because often these old wells, the well header data that's available is pretty minimal. And so anything we can do to do that will be a useful tool. But that's just a quick highlight of the things that we're up to. I encourage anybody to reach out to us if you have questions or comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. And I just want to emphasize that Andrew's office does have funding sources for the action of looking for and documenting and classifying the wells. So it's exciting. Okay, so now we will turn to our last person who was part of the organizing committee for the conference, Scott St. John, and you're on the operations side.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scott St. John. I'm with Red Dirt Energy. We're a plugging company and also involved in providing strategic monetization for legacy wells as well. One of the things that I will parrot Dan as well, things are moving quickly, and one of our focus points is the state funding and the federal funding for plugging these orphan wells. Another thing that we've been working on since March, two things actually, is really helping the tribes on developing their orphaned well plugging plan and programs for obtaining grants. It's interesting to see how, they've been kind of thrown into this area of orphaned wells and plugging wells when really they've relied on the BIA for so long to manage their minerals, manage their drilling programs, manage all of their oil and gas assets to a large extent. And now they're kind of tasked with, through the DOI, with establishing their own programs. So we've been fortunate enough to help up in upwards of 10 tribes in getting their grants and developing their grants for them, and hopefully leading them to a successful plugging program and allowing them to get some funding to plug wells on their lands. The other part that we've been focused on is the carbon credit space. There's several companies out there that are kind of entering that space. One of the sticking points is how do you solve that emissions testing and verification, and what program is going to win out. We know ACR, American Carbon Registry, along with the Well Done Foundation, has their program out there. We're waiting on that to be approved. Maybe Curtis can shed some light on that one. But there's also a company called Carbon Path out there they're sort of spearheading and really taking a gamble on this, which I think is interesting. And they've got some interesting methodologies into how they're testing and how they're going about providing credits, or they're calling it methane tokens. So that's an interesting space. But those are some of the follow-up things that we've been working on since March. And Susan, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you. That's great and really exciting and a fantastic segue to our first presenter, Curtis Shuck of the Well Done Foundation. So I'd like to encourage you to share your screen, and we welcome your presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Susan. Hopefully I can drive the bus here for a moment and get the party started.
Perfect.
You got a visual?
Yes, that looks great.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's always the time of the presentation where everybody is on the edge of their seat. Is the IT actually going to work today? So anyway, just a little recap. So I'm Curtis Shuck. I'm the chairman of the Well Done Foundation. Been at this since just 2019 in the Orphan Well space, and just for complete transparency, this was 100% by accident. So happened to be in up near this image here, talking to a bunch of farmers one day in northern Montana, and happened to cross my first orphan well. And that was the day that, looking back, has changed my life in many ways. And this is us celebrating Earth Day on that site a couple of years ago with a third grade class from a place called Sunburst, Montana, which is the home of one of Montana's legacy oil fields, Kevin Sunburst, and a large refining center back in the 1920s and 30s. So back to what drives us just quickly is really what we're passing on to the next generations. And for me personally, and for our organization, that's at the core of all of our decision making, is what is it that we're contributing, and that we're the legacy that we're leaving behind. These were just some inflection points, and no need to dwell here. This is stuff that's available on our website, but just a quick highlight of some of the areas that we're working today. We're now active and more growing every day. We've got teams on the ground today in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. I'm taking a break in Montana, but I'll be back in New Mexico here tomorrow. And these are just some of the faces of the folks that make up this network, if you would, or our ecosystem of partners. These are just some of the highlights from last year, but I really wanted today to dig into what this is all about on the methane measurement and monitoring space, because that was something that I really didn't have a chance to cover a lot during the conference in Oklahoma City. And so a big part of this work is simply just getting to the location. And many of these orphan well locations, the access is long gone, or certainly isn't anything that matches the requirements of today's modern machinery and equipment. And so, just getting to these locations is critical. So a lot of the equipment that we use as we're scoping a particular project, one of the biggest factors for us is portability. Our ability to get this equipment effectively to the location. I would just tell you, probably 90% of the sites that we visit across the country are walk-ups, and some of those are hike-ups. You'll see some of those are boat ups, but very rarely do we enjoy the opportunity to be able to drive directly to the location. This is a shot of myself with some folks in the Allegheny National Forest up in Pennsylvania, with a bunch of foresters and some folks from the DEP. And you can see the Orphan Well that's in the foreground there. And everybody's scratching their head of how are we going to get there? Obviously, before this well was drilled, the beavers hadn't dammed up the creek and created this crazy wetland. Of course, when the U.S. Forest Service took me out to look at their cast of wells a couple of years ago, they picked the worst of the worst. Another shot from Pennsylvania, just so you get a chance to sort of see a little bit of what we're dealing with out there. And you get a shot like this where the artesians are home, and this wellbore has now become a pathway for groundwater to make its way to the surface, aquifers to make their way to the surface. And we certainly see that all across the country. West Texas maybe being one of the most vivid reminders of that. We're dealing with projects like this where we've got river monsters to overcome, just figuring out a way to get safely to that well, to be able to measure it and monitor it. And then thinking about coming up with a plugging plan to help support that. I mean, I think the risks are obvious beyond the air emissions issue, but the impact to this waterway and what it has to do with drinking water, aquifer, or drinking water storage, and community impacts is huge. Another thing that I wanted to touch on, only because this is what we deal with all over the country, are other risks. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see one of my friends at one of our well pads there. And, we're just kind of entering back into snake season now. And so a stark reminder for our teams that are in the field to carry a shovel and to just be playing heads up ball every day. The one thing about this work, and again, right now we're talking about just getting to the well itself and what we're going to see when we get there, whether it's again by land or by water. This is us working down in Louisiana out in Caddo Lake, which is actually the home of the first over water oil well that was drilled in the mid 1910s. And, again, just getting to these wells to be able to do the work is a huge aspect. The other thing about that, of course, once you get there, then what do you do? How do you rig up on this? The one thing that is going to permeate throughout this discussion today is just a disclaimer and a stark warning to everyone that's on this call that what you're about to see is dangerous, and it comes with extreme risk, and it should only be performed by professionals who are trained and have the appropriate equipment to be protected. I'm reminded of this every day that I'm in the field, of the fact that we're dealing with infrastructure that has either failed or is failing or is in various stages of disrepair, thus why they're referred to as abandoned and orphan wells. I will tell you, one of the wake-up calls for me just most recently is when I was contacted by a citizen scientist group who was explaining to me their intention of mounting a campaign in one of the states that has a prolific number of orphan wells, to get out there and start identifying wells and doing some measurement and monitoring. And I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. And of course, my immediate response was, you need to be extremely cautious. Every day in the field, we're faced with real life risks of explosion from stored energy, from failing infrastructure, from fire, from poisoning of H2S gas and high levels of methane. that'll wreck your day in a hurry, and there's usually not a second chance associated with that. So I just want to make sure that throughout this discussion today that I'm touching base on that factor, because this isn't something that is a do-it-yourself type of a program. At the base of the Well Done Foundation is our tech platform, this Well Intel GIS system that we have. And I know there's a lot of similar type of programs out there, but for us, this is really our project management software. And you're going to get a chance to see sort of how we refer to that on a daily basis. But it's critical because we have so much data that we're managing across the country from our various projects. You know, we heard a little bit today about some of the will historical data, some of the regulatory data, the data, of course, that we're generating in the field every day from measurement and monitoring, all of the plugging activity, and then, of course, the post-closure monitoring and restoration activities. This is just a shot of an orphan well out in New Mexico, working with the state there as part of their IIJA program. We actually started measuring for them in July of this year. Prior to the release of those funds, the state felt that it was critical to kind of get a jump on this and understand what these wells were doing. So we've had teams on the ground there again since last summer. One of the things that we're faced with every day, and this is a shot of us on the Texas side of the border, but still in the Permian Basin, is just the elevated levels of H2S. And again, for us, it's about being properly protected and knowing what we're doing in order to be able to number one, go home safely every day, but number two, to be able to get these critical measurements so that companies and regulators can use that data for really sound decision making. But I would say probably 20% of our time these days is spent under full air. This is another shot of us working up in Kentucky in an Amish family's front yard. And again, the gas is so robust. Some of these wells that we're testing, that we have an emission destruction program that we run in parallel with our measurement and monitoring program, because we want to make sure, again, from the Well Done Foundation's perspective, that we're leaving it better than the way that we found it. Again, every well is absolutely different and unique. And so being able to devise a testing strategy and get the appropriate equipment deployed is critical. Often these are remote locations that have little to no cell coverage. So in addition to rigging up and measuring and monitoring, you also have to be thinking about protecting your personnel in the field and having contingency plans in place for communications and emergency response should that be required. Here's a shot of a well that we're actually on today and will be a subject of some of the data that you're going to see. This is an orphan well up in Ohio. This is the condition of that particular well. I don't think you're going to have any sound, but you'll get a chance to see some visualization. Again, and this is, while it's an orphan well, it's relatively new to the landscape. This well was drilled in the 70s, but you can see that this infrastructure is failing and this instance actually has failed. And oftentimes, as we're preparing to do our measurement and monitoring and doing our initial assessment, we have to identify all those risks and come up with the best approach then for being able to rig up and measure and monitor. This is just a quick shot of our platform and of the wells that are currently in our universe across the country. And this particular well then is located in Summit. And this is a shot here of a snapshot I took from our test earlier today. So this one is ripping at a pretty high clip, as you can see there, by the 4,792 cubic feet per day. And of course, we're destroying that gas as we're measuring it in that particular area. But here's some of the data that our equipment is providing. You know, one of the things that's critical in the methane measurement and monitoring space, certainly from our perspective, is it's got to be, you know, point source. Our measurements are direct at the well, and whether it's a direct mechanical connection at the wellhead, or we use one of our Dorothy chamber units, depending on if it's an open hole or what that configuration is. But it's got to be point source. And so there's a lot of great detection technology out there from space and drones and what have you. But in order to get really quantifiable results, you've got to be at the wellhead, which then makes this a ground game. In addition to that, we've got to have continuous monitoring. And you can see even in this graph here over a 6-hour run that, you know, this well has, and every well has its own unique personality. And so, you know, to just do a walk-up point in time grab sample measurement is great, but it really doesn't provide you with the whole story. And it is critical, as we're talking about robust data that then is quantifiable, that's defensible, and at the end of the day is auditable. And whether that data is going to enter into the carbon market space, or whether that data is going to be used to support the IIJA investment and be able to demonstrate to the public what that return on investment is, it really needs to be reliable. And so that's what we're striving for right now, is to get these platforms and protocols in place so that it can be, you know, widely used and people can benefit from good data. This is a data-rich environment, and I'm going to show you where we came from in the early stages to where we're at today. You know, our ability to present this data in different formats is also really important. You know, depending on the audience, depending on what it is that we really need to communicate to them. And this is just the dashboard stuff, really a way to visualize the data. Of course, this is all backed up by the individual data points in the CSV files. You get a chance to see just a little bit of what that looks like in just a minute. This is a shot of a well that we're working on in New Mexico, and this is what it looks like. Drive up to these things sometimes. Should definitely be, you know, your first clue, and you can see that the gas is ripping, you know, past the packing at the tubing head there. And, you know, so immediately we're always taking site air samples, or we call them field gas samples, just so we know that our people can be protected. Here's just another shot of again, what we're dealing with there. And this is always a red flag to our team. You know, it's exciting, I guess, when you see a well that is emitting gas, to know that, you know, we got a live one on, but it also means there is a significant amount of stored energy and high degree of risk. This particular well has a very robust H2S signature, and you'll see that here in just a minute. So with that then comes the devising of the appropriate way to rig up and measure and monitor on this well. And this is a shot here of what some of that configuration was. Of course, you see on the right that we're flaring as we're measuring that. You know, for us, it's always a consideration. And the fact that this is a high H2S well, you know, we have to then employ those extra protective steps. Here's some data of one of the runs that we did on this particular well. And this shows, you know, kind of two highlights. On the right-hand side, we did a highlight of one of the peaks that we wanted to show. Obviously, the trajectory of flow on this well is illustrated in the blue there, is one that was moving at a very high clip. And so we needed to really have, you know, some robust measurement over this period of time. And so again, the graph is great because it does show that, you know, a good illustration of what that well is doing. But then, of course, on the left-hand side are the CSV files, which is really critical for several reasons. Number one, it allows you then to run a particular analysis that allows for all of that data to be validated and verified by a third party. You know, we're tracking in addition to the flow rate, but, you know, obviously what the pressure is at the time, what the temperature is. You know, we're also taking separately weather observations during the period of measurement as a requirement under the Department of Interior guidance. Things like geostamping the location with, you know, with a robust GPS reading is also critical. Just so, again, it's all about, you know, zero fudge factor. So all of this equipment is geo-referenced to the locations that we're working. And that's really critical at the end of the day when we go to present this data then to the whoever it is, whether, again, it's a carbon market or whether it's on the state and federal programs under IIJA. In addition to the flow, of course, of methane gas or gas period is also the fact of what is the gas signature, what's the speciation of that gas, and what's specifically the concentration of methane. And you see here that while the total explosive gas concentration is over 80%, the methane component is about 67 or 670,000 parts per million, which, as you think about it, with some of the equipment that is available out there today and the detection side, this far outpaces its effective range. And so we use third-party laboratories for analysis for our gas sampling. We do have on-site capabilities for doing gas analysis through the use of gas chromatographs. But typically, depending on the amount of wells that we're doing in a particular field and a particular project, we'll be utilizing our third-party lab partners. I wanted to show this video here real quick on the left. Please just watch if you would. This is how I first started measuring methane gas flows up in Montana. And this was using some of Dr. Mary Kang's early work with flow chamber. And long before we started using the vent buster system or any of the other technology, this was really, for me at the time, was proof of concept. Pretty simple exercise, a chamber with a known volume, exhausting the chamber, venting the chamber completely, and then capping it up, putting the sensing equipment on it, and then timing how quickly it would take for that chamber to regenerate to get to a level of gas concentration, and then just doing some quick back of the napkin math. So this is how the journey started for me in Montana in 2019, and we've come a long way since those early days, from being on this particular well, the Anderson 1, in the early stages there before we had plugged any in this particular field, to last summer, my ability to go back onto this field after all 9 wells in that particular 40-acre spacing had been completed. And the acreage had been replanted fully replanted for the first time in nearly 100 years. And so that was a pretty cool celebration, because at the end of the day, you always have to be thinking about what's the end game. And the end game is, again, leaving it better than the way that we found it. I've got, a bunch of other slides here that I was going to run through, and these have just been kind of some of our really, awesome projects that are a part of the Leave It Better One Well at a Time program. This is one that we just got completed recently right before the conference with our partners back in Pennsylvania and Erie, PA. And I think with that, Susan, I'm going to go ahead and leave it here just so we make sure that we leave Dwayne lots of time.
Well, thank you. That's amazing. And I just really want to thank you for such an all-inclusive presentation that emphasizes the real world of what you're doing, real world setting. Now, I think that you just plugged one in Oklahoma. Is that correct?
We're just doing some measurement there right now, Susan, but we're excited
Okay.
about kicking our first projects off.
Oh, nice. Well, thank you. That was amazing. And it's great photography too. And the rattlesnake went under the rock. Ooh. All kinds of
That was the
things.
pump jack that we were rigged up right there. That was the pump jack foundation. So yeah, you
Oh,
always
wasn't it? Ooh, even worse. Anyway, well, thank you. So I'd like to welcome Dwayne Purvis and like to invite you to share your screen, and we'll follow up with your presentation.
Hey, thank you for that, Susan. Tell me, what time do you need me to stop?
Well, I think I'll let everybody know that we can go a little bit late because I think we want to have time. Just go as long as you
Super.
like, and then we'll.
Oh, don't tell me that, Susan.
Okay.
I'm at for 15 minutes. Hey,
Yeah,
but
15.
thank you to everybody who spoke. All of the guys who introduced themselves are actively trying to solve what's a real problem. And while Curtis is in the field, the hands-on actually fixing the problems, my work has been in the field, or in the office rather, as a reservoir engineer. And for decades, what I've helped people to do is to make investment decisions, acquisitions, divestitures, drilling. And over that time period, I have watched the kinds of projects that come across my desk change. Now, there are a couple of references earlier to historical events and things that are important to the issue overall. And I'll just reference those quickly. This graph shows the production from the US broken into three chief components: onshore conventional in green, which peaked in the 1970s. In gray is Alaska, which peaked in the 80s, and then shale. Now, the curves look steeper than they actually are because this time scale is 130 years. But we didn't have groundwater protections systematically across the regulatory agencies until the 50s, and we didn't have API numbers until the 60s. So the problem that Andrew and the DOE are dealing with are these pre-API wells, for which we have very poor records and which were drilled and then plugged according to the weakest standards the industry saw. The technology we use today, as Professor Radonjic said, is the same technology we've been using since the 60s and the same placement technology we've used since the 1970s, which is balanced plug. Unfortunately, there's a paucity of research on how well those have held up. But for this particular question, the critical change in the regulatory regime came in 1986 in response to the price crash. Regulatory agencies across the country allowed idle wells to accumulate, to stand idle indefinitely. Prior to the price crash, Texas allowed an operator 3 months to either bring a well back online or to plug it, a mere 3 months. That was extended to 12 months and then extended indefinitely with a permit. The result is that at this point in time, the average well age of all the wells in the US is about 37 years. The average unplugged well is nearly 40 years old. So that makes mechanical issues more likely. Now, it's true that our production has spiked in recent years, but it's easy to lose track of the fact that the ownership and the production is separated. It's bifurcated between the green and the red. Now, this graph, don't try to read the details, outlines the concentration of production from wells in the US on a BOE basis. 7% of the producing wells make 92% of the BOE. And that ownership is largely bifurcated. Pioneer in the Sprayberry and maybe some wells in the Niobrara Basin have both old vertical and new horizontal, but by and large, ownership of the young, highly productive shale wells is bifurcated from that of the old vertical conventional wells. And of course, the wells have been handed down. Those old legacy producers of vertical wells have been handed down from smaller and smaller companies, away from the companies with a larger asset base. So as it stands, 72% of the unplugged wells onshore US are either idle or produce less than 1 barrel of oil equivalent per day. Remember, a stripper well is technically defined as 10 or in some cases 15 barrels a day. We have a third of our producers and about 59% of the unplugged wells at zero, but a third of the producers producing less than 1 BOE per day. This problem has snuck up on us, and the things that we believed and understood for the history of my career can no longer be relied on. So the costs that are coming are often thought to be small, and a large part of that is the issue of not fully understanding the scope of what we need to do. We certainly have to do downhole operations, and most of what has been done for decommissioning or retirement operations in the last decades has been downhole operations because, of course, other parts of the facilities are still in use by other wells. But we certainly have to do downhole operations and surface, but we also have a significant issue with contingency and unplanned costs. The worst story I've heard is a plugging job AFE'd for $18,000 that came in actual at $2 million. There are always going to be cost overruns, rarely that large, but always cost overruns, so that if you plug 5 wells, you will most likely see the most likely outcome, that planned mode of the distribution. But if you plug 500 wells, you're guaranteed to sample the whole range of the distribution. And the average in that wide skewed distribution will be significantly greater than the mode. So it's not appropriate for our planning purposes to take the most likely cost, the planned cost, and multiply it by the number of wells. And those unplanned costs carry forward also to the surface activities we have to do. In some places where we must restore the surface, not all have that cost, but we are required in all places to do remediation. And then on top of that, we maintain liability into the future. So the part of what we have missed in our economic evaluation of these assets is the scope of the costs. And the other thing we've missed is how they impact our cash flows. So the wells like Curtis showed, the orphan wells that are polluting and damaging water, were not always orphan wells. Somebody didn't plan properly. And a couple million wells that we have unplugged risk becoming orphan wells and a public liability if we do not understand the economics properly. So when I started my career, I was told that abandonment costs, decommissioning costs were irrelevant. They were too small to affect the outcomes, the economic outcomes. And I tested the theory and it was true. The problem is that in this point in the life cycle, those are no longer true. Let me show you this example. This is a schematic cash flow based on a real life situation. And along the x-axis, we have the years before the economic limit. The net present value is on the y-axis. So as time progresses, as the field approaches its abandonment, the value slowly comes down and converges to zero. And that is true if you're paying your costs along the way, or if there are no asset decommissioning responsibilities. But in real life, we put a lump of cash outflow at the very end of that cash flow. And that lump of cash outflow, that CapEx, is discounted more than all of the income. Normally, evaluating a project, the capital is first, it's undiscounted, it's real money. And then we risk by discounting the future cash flows. In this case, the guaranteed obligation to plug our wells that comes at the end is discounted more then all of the revenues that are uncertain that come before it. And that changes these curves. What happens, in fact, is that the capital expenses, which are discounted more, become less influential at higher discount rates, and the present values invert. There's a point in time at which the PV20 becomes a larger number than the PV10. There's a point in time when the PV10 becomes larger than the total undiscounted net cash flow. I looked at a project for a client. I looked over his shoulder the other day, and he had a net present value of a couple $1 million on this portfolio. The total undiscounted cash flow revenue was 10 million, and the total undiscounted cash flow for the abandonment liabilities was 30 million, which is to say, at cash flowing asset, positive net present value, negative undiscounted. If he owned the asset, he would collect $22 million to come home with, and then he'd have to come out of pocket for 30 million at the end of the day. The present value no longer works to describe the cash flows that are coming in the future. Let me show you the situation another way. This is a tabular form of the remaining cash flows as you approach the economic limit, starting at the top to the bottom. This first column shows the ratio of present value. That is the present value of all of the revenues divided by the present value of the decommissioning liabilities. And you can see 20 years before, the ratio is 200. It's irrelevant. The net present value doesn't invert until the last 3 years or so before the well becomes uneconomic. On a cash basis, though, that inversion occurs much sooner. The cash ratio is only 5-to-1 at the beginning, and the cash required to plug for that well to plug itself is equal to the last 5 years of operations, which is to say, you get into the well life and you send a jib to your joint interest owners for a bill equal to all the money you have paid them for the last 5 years. That could be a hard pill to swallow. But what really complicates matters is the fact that we have been accumulating our plugging liability and not paying it as we go. So the last well on the lease is responsible to plug also all of the other siblings on the lease that have been previously shut in and no longer contribute to cash flow. We saw a minute ago that in the US, 59% of the wells that are unplugged also stand idle. So what I've done here is to show the proportion of the wells that stand idle. If 50% of the wells stand idle, then paying for the plugging takes an additional approximately 5 years. And then as the proportion of idle wells increases, the years of cash flow required to pay for it also increase. So as we sit here today and we do nothing with our assets, we collect the cash flow from this year, we move down this curve and we move over as other wells on the lease or in the field get shut in and accumulated. The trap closes from both sides. There's more liability and less cash flow. So for an operator to make, or an investor to make good economic decisions, he needs a new way to think about this so that he's not coming out of pocket at the end of his ownership for something equal to everything or more that he has collected over the life of the project. So then forward-looking investments, the simplest economic yardstick is called payout. That is the period of time it takes to accumulate the cash equal to the capital already invested. I propose a new economic yardstick, just a yardstick, not a business strategy, but it's just payout in reverse. It's the amount of time for the cash to accumulate equal to the capital that will be expended. Like I said, this is not to say this is the way the cash needs to go, but it's a starting point for measuring the business plan, the cash flow in the business plan, to make a real strategy on how to get things plugged. So then we'd sit here at a point in time in the middle of production, we'd say, for example, I have X number of years of distributable life, and then the remaining period is holdback. And what I found in my practice is that it's entirely possible for a field to be cash flow positive. It's for it to have 25 years of economic life projected, but also possible at the same time to have only a couple of years of distributable life, which is to say only a couple of years, which in the best case scenario, profits can be taken home. Now, that analysis does not consider risk, does not consider the fact that their revenues are highly volatile, highly uncertain, because they're sensitive to small changes in prices, costs, and production when your margins are thin at late life, by comparison to the fact that the plugging obligations are fixed and are almost certainly appreciating over time. So there are other economic yardsticks we could look at. And those are described here. They all have analogies in the forward-looking standard economics. But if we don't look at it the right way, we cannot make good economic decisions. This is just to drive the point home, is a real life field. I've reconstructed the cash flow based on commodity prices and actual production. In 2015, they were projecting this kind of cash flow, pretty significant. Of course, price changed. Even with cutting their OPEX in half, the field barely managed to make a profit. It was clear by the time price turned down in 2015, there was some kind of trouble here. But in fact, the wells, which are standing unplugged and producing today, should have begun paying for their plugging liabilities in 2008. All the cash flow from 2008 to the present would be necessary to plug these wells. So what I hope is that operators and investors will look at their cash flows a little differently so they can make better decisions and not end up turning over their assets to a public liability. If we think the public is mad at us now, just wait until we give them hundreds of billions of dollars of liabilities for them to pay for. Thank you.
Thank you. That's that's an incredibly sobering proposal, and I'm just wondering if anybody has actually like jumped up there and said, "Hey, let's do this."
I will not publish a reserve report at this point, Susan, without this analysis. I will not. Historically, reserve reports have written a note to say we've excluded P&A at the client's request or something along those lines.
Well, and it's further complicated now because, I mean, I don't know. I remember thinking back to my engineering economics classes and like your present value versus future value, and then the interest rates that you're using. Well, with inflation, this is even infinitely worse. So, yes. But I would
no,
say,
that's right.
But I would say that probably most people secretly hope for some magic technology that will happen, and then the other strategy is just never ever sell, so you never take your losses.
Right. And there was a time in the 2000s when waiting for prices worked, and you can see it on that graph that I just showed. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, when oil price was still on the order of $20, $25, prices came back and cash flow exploded. But all through that time period, production depleted. Production continued to decline. It's what fields do. So at this point, if the field is declining 5% per year and it's barely economic, then the oil price must appreciate 5% a year to hold steady. So 5 years from now, I don't think it's feasible to expect that oil price will indefinitely increase by more than 5% a year, or more than 10% a year, depending on the decline.
Well,
that we have.
yeah, so you're talking about the commodities prices. I'm just talking about even just operation costs and plugging costs, et cetera, with
No,
inflation.
you're exactly right.
But at any
I-
rate, let me invite the audience to open up their microphones and they can jump in. For Curtis and Dwayne. So I noticed Bruce has said, talking about his experience. Bruce, would you like to comment? Or I can read your comment. Well, Bruce says that when he was in operations, he would pull a percentage of runs.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I used to pull a percentage of every run check, and it was agreed upon by all the partners. And it accumulated interest over the years, but a lot of I've always been afraid that when it comes time to plug a well, that the interest owners would leave you hanging and not pay their part. So it was self-insurance for me, but it also would alleviate the problem that Mr. Purvis was talking about, because
Yes.
the money is already there. And you
Yeah,
can,
well done, Bruce. Was that
you can
something in
produce
a
those
custom version of the JOA, or how did you get that done?
just have them sign an agreement, just a separate agreement from the JO.
Yeah, good job. Yeah, the JOA really, the standard JOA should have made allowances for this decades ago, but the standard didn't, and some with foresight have made arrangements.
Well, it's just a problem I recognized a long time ago because other people got hurt.
Yep.
So I noticed Shane Masson has a question. Talking about including P&A on reserve reports. Is it a trend that we should anticipate coming, and he points out that it would literally destroy the borrowing base of every company that has wells more than 10 years old.
So the SPE and the SPEE both put out some guidance. The guidance from the SPE is not as detailed, not as specific to evaluations as the guidance from the SPEE. The Society of Professional Evaluation Engineers, Petroleum Evaluation Engineers, states in the recommended evaluation practice number 1 that the report should include everything relevant to cash flow, and it specifically names abandonment costs. Now, as a matter of practice, that recommended practice, that element of the recommended practice hasn't been followed. But the principles are clear that we need to explain to the user of the report the things that matter. And if the plugging obligations of a company are part of its normal business operations, and therefore can supersede first liens in a bankruptcy. Therefore, it's relevant information that needs to be included. The practice across the industry of reserve reports is beginning to change. I've talked with people who consistently encourage it. I don't know of anyone else who has drawn the line in the sand that I have. But as this issue is recognized by lenders, also by acquirers, and it's much more common consideration in acquisitions. I'd say half or more of acquisitions recognize the issue already. It will permeate the system, and it will become part of reserve reports.
Yeah,
I couldn't tell you when.
Well, I mean, and it's terrifying, but on the other hand, plugging, it depends on how old the well, et cetera. And as Mileva pointed out, need to make sure that the plugging materials are worthy for maintaining well integrity. But that said, I mean, you have people like Diversified Energy that, I mean, how courageous. They bought hundreds or tens of thousands of old wells. in the last 10 years. And they are actively going in, and they have a plugging company in Appalachia, but they've also just gone in and tried to make the long-lived or long-lived assets longer lived. So super interesting. So I've got a question for Curtis. So that's going from financial apocalypse to environmental. Here we go. How often do you see 380 meters per cubed cubic meters a day? That's 272 kilograms a day, exclamation point, for an orphan well. That seems like a big number.
Yeah, I would tell you that, that those are what are referred to in the industry as super emitters. And, they're, again, it varies a little bit field to field, but, say maybe 10%, 5 to 10% nationally, depending on where you're at. What is interesting about that, Susan, is the fact that, because every well is so unique, that it can be located right next to several wells that have very low emission footprints. And so that's, certainly us, banging the drum about measuring every well to get at least, some sense of what those emissions components are, so that it allows regulators and others to make, really solid data-based decisions on prioritization of which wells are, doing the most damage. But yeah, I mean, obviously those are ones that we come across, that we approach very carefully, because, the risk on those are exponentially higher. The stored energy, the explosive nature, the high concentration of H2S gas in any kind of a considerable release, then if you're not prepared, will, wreck your day permanently. And that's what, like I said earlier, that's what really concerns me about a lot of this discussion right now around citizen scientists and having the wrong people out running around. God help us. It's really concerning. But yeah, so say use that 10%, as kind of as a big number, but they're not always concentrated. They can be sprinkled around, any numbers of other, marginal producers. And there was a question that came earlier about the Well Done Foundation. Yes, we are a nonprofit, and the reason for that is that, I think that makes it for us our ability to focus on a larger group of wells than that maybe are more marginal in terms of their emission footprint. To be able to, it's just like peanut butter on a piece of bread, right? And more peanut butter, bigger piece of bread, we can spread it across. And that was a strategy in 2019, and looking at it at the time when there was zero money, and so our ability now to progress and scale up beyond the car washes and bake sales is going to require, a couple of different strategies. And certainly carbon markets are one for discussion, and, there are others. I think, Dwayne, you bring up a good point that, operators, savvy operators, responsible operators who are starting to really look at this intently now. I mean, they're waiting around for a magic bullet. I think that there are some opportunities that, can be explored immediately. But the first thing is being able to quantify, what the well is doing in terms of an emission component, and then coming up with a strategy. So anyway, long-winded answer. Sorry, Susan.
No, that's good. So Herman Vaca and Jim Robertson have kind of two sides of the same question. And that is, basically, is our current plugging technology such that we are confident that the well will not be a problem going forward, perhaps for hundreds of years or more? And then also thinking of Mileva's thoughts. And then on the other side, are there enough reserves left to entice an operator to do a workover and restore the well to active commercial economic status. So both are,
I'll say first that Curtis can speak better to the durability. What I will say is that the need is for the wells to stay plugged for the entire future of humanity. Though there's not a natural process in the most depths and most locations that will pinch off the wellbore and seal it naturally. So if we want not to have water coming up and into the water table or into our rivers, for example, we need to make sure that that stays plugged for, well, human history is about 10,000 years recorded already. But the bigger question, the other question about returning a well to production. Empirically, theoretically, it's possible. And people have made the argument for years that there's an option value. We don't want to plug the well because maybe prices will get good enough that we can bring it back online. Empirically speaking, it doesn't turn out that way. It is pretty unusual for a well to come back online and make money. It's very unusual for a well to come back online and make much money. If you had a gas well that could make money at $8 or $9 an MCF, you would have turned it back on in the last couple of years. If you had an oil well that could make money at $80 a barrel, you should have turned it on last year. If those wells did not come back online, then it's unlikely that they can be expected in the future to be able to pay for operating costs alone, let alone the multiple years of cash flow necessary to accumulate the value the cost of plugging.
yeah, that's a good point. Now, maybe Curtis can talk to the other side and about both sides of the issue.
Gee, I think that's a red dirt question. No, anyway, I mean, I would just, where's all the cementers when you need them, right? No, anyway, you know, I mean, we sure hope so. I think the conversations that are ongoing right now about, you know, about new materials development is absolutely critical. And we sure welcome that. I mean, you know, right now we're using the best available science, and that is what we've got. And we, you know, and in addition to the best available science, so I also want to point out, it's about making sure that you've got really responsible eyes on the project, because you wonder why cementing jobs are done at 2 in the morning, right? And there's a reason for that. You know, contractors, we love them, but they do, you know, typically they do what you inspect and not what you expect. And so, you know, using the materials that we do have available today, the best thing we can do is to make sure that they're put in, you know, pursuant to the plan, and that the work is done, you know, with quality and to the industry standards. And you know, and then when new technology comes along, I think we need to be prepared to try it. I know that there's a lot of field trials that are happening right now in New Mexico and other places around the country, and we're certainly excited to see what the, you know, what the advent is. We've got companies like, you know, right here in Montana, a company called BioSqueeze, who are, you know, using some sort of new materials. I think we need to be open to that. And of course, the challenge is the long lead time on those materials approvals through the process. Look at what's happening in the States right now, for instance, just with the transition for the different types of cement from typical type 1, type 2, or class 1, class 2, to some of the new carbon light cements. And, you know, it takes a significant amount of time to get those approved through the standards organizations, or through the, you know, some of the state organizations that have to sign off on that. So I think as an industry, we need to be open to being able to move quickly with the testing and implementation of those new materials.
Great.
Solid points.
Hey, Susan, I just wanted to add something that it was discussed in 2019. SP had a P&A forum that I was part of it. And I know we're talking about the orphans and, the idle and abandoned wells, but it was interesting because this was primarily industry folks there. And they were saying that, in terms of the numbers that Dwayne showed and, how to deal with this in the future, it was mentioned that perhaps doing they phrased it this way: drilling with the P&A in mind. So it kind of complete cultural change, of how you construct the wellbore in the first place, so that when it's time to P&A it, it's kind of easier to do it. But I don't know, that was just a conversation. I don't know if anything is being done about it.
That's a really good point. And I know my experience in operating, of course you have your bond that you put that's P&A, but it's never enough for any kind of unexpected expenses. But those are usually factored in, or at least we did. But to Dwayne's point, they're insufficient. So and your point too about the different kinds of materials is just really great. Okay, so here's another question. Are the high costs of plugging some wells due to corroded carbon steel casing that parts of the casing is being removed prior to plugging, then becoming a downhole fishing operation to remove the corroded material? Maybe Curtis or Scott, have you had to do a lot of fishing to get the corroded tubing out?
Well, one of the things that, and I'll let Scott pop in too, but one of the things that we see certainly in orphan wells is that, again, these wells have just been, abandoned and let go. And when there's rods and tubing left in the hole, it makes the extraction or the clean out very difficult because, again, depending on the corrosive nature of the environment that it's in, gas or fluid, it can become difficult depending on the regulatory agency. You're always expected to make a best effort, right, to remove the material from the wellbore to get to a clean hole down to TD. And I think that that's a reasonable expectation. There are those times though when fishing you're unable to recover the material and they ask you to go in and start milling. All of those, every one of those becomes quite expensive quite quickly. And so at some point you need to start to make some really educated decisions. But yes, I mean, that is a factor, and a huge factor for sure in orphan wells across the country is the ability to, extract whatever's left in the wellbore. And again, a lot of these do have rods and tubing, and that is problematic.
Yeah, I'll pair it a little bit what Curtis is saying. Every well is different, and you come up against many challenges during the course of plugging a well. So and just like Curtis said, there's rods and tubing been downhole for many years, and it creates challenges with each one, and no well is the same. So with every passing minute is your cost just increase. So yeah, it's just not the corroded casing that's fallen down hole. There's a plethora of issues that you can run up against. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why costs can increase on plugging a well.
Excellent. So Jason Fisher has a question. Great presentation, Curtis. What are the current skills and talents needed for the methane emissions measurements and monitoring piece?
Well, that is a great question, and couldn't have teed that up better. We just entered into an agreement with the American Petroleum Institute to start looking at some training for that particular space. Indeed, we think that we can collectively get that down to a certification type of a level program with a semester or, possibly even less to get these people out into the field to understand, number one, they've got to have, petroleum 101 safety, first and foremost to even, get it out of the pickup truck. But then, understanding the equipment, understanding the, the environment that we're working in, the type of, instrumentation that's being required. So, and in addition to the standard plug-in and abandonment, work that Scott and his team and other teams are doing, sort of that more traditional oil and gas worker side, now this is something that's a little bit different, requires a little bit more finesse. I would tell you our typical team makeup in the field is one roustabout and one instrument tech. And the reason for that is pretty different skill sets. Sometimes the best way to tune in the instrumentation is not with a hammer. And so we want to make sure that, that they understand that there's perhaps a different way, but, we're looking at the instrumentation side or the methane measurement and monitoring piece. And that includes, quantification and identification through the use of these other platforms, UAVs, what have you, is going to be a growing field. And we're excited about what that means as far as opportunities for, either, folks that are in the industry today or folks that are coming into the industry. But again, we see that as a, roughly semester-long program. We can get people in the field, and the other nice thing is that we can offer them field experience immediately, either as internships or once they're through the program. So I hope I answered that.
Thanks, Curtis. That was great, and I'm glad that you mentioned too using drones and UAVs for that. Some of them have sensors like magnetometers that they can detect the metal in the ground. So even if it's covered with vegetation, it's also LiDAR. So thank you for mentioning that, because that answers one of the other questions. And our final question is from Shane Matson, and is, do the states, and I think this is probably one that Scott can talk to, do the states offer any incentives or for plugging?
So not at the moment. There are no incentives for the states don't offer any incentives to plug wells at this time. I know Texas has a mandate that they must plug, that operators must plug 10% of their I guess the category would be abandoned wells or inactive wells per year. So that's a mandate by the state, but there's no incentive to other than fines levied on them to plug wells as far as any kind of financial gain from that perspective.
Well, and the other thing too is, like, as we look at idle and inactive versus abandoned, well, I mean, a lot of things, obviously they just stay inactive and waiting for actual plugging. But sometimes they're just inactive due to costs of the price, the commodity prices. And and so you have a big conflict of interest. You have the royalty owners who would be very hostile toward any state initiative to just jump in there and plug their wells. So, it's one of those things where best efforts should be made to actually keep that thing producing. And then doing something with the produced water. We have so many different things we can do now with the brine mining and purification. Anyway.
Right. And a lot of times, a lot of these fields change hands quite frequently. And, you get new reservoir engineers in there and they want to do their own study on what wells may be feasible to not plug. And so when we're talking about the mandates by the state, there are extensions you can get, and you obviously have to justify those extensions so that, in a way that, it can be done in a way that we're analyzing this. Our reservoir engineers are looking at this. They're not really sure that the idle wells or the inactive wells right now will be inactive. We think we can bring more production on if we do certain things with these wells. So So that's a challenge as well, is when you have change of operators on a lot of these assets, that it can cause inadvertent delays in actually doing something with these wells.
That's a really good point. Well, I'm so excited that we had such enthusiasm that we're almost 30 minutes over, and we still have some questions, but we kind of have to cut it off. But I want to thank everybody. I want to thank our presenters, and also just mention again that this was a kind of combined effort from AAPG and especially our Division of Engineering Geosciences, and hope to encourage you to join AAPG if you're not a member, and join DEG. And also happy to talk about Tulsa, the Desk and Derrick of Tulsa, and that's a lot of the more of the process management, that type of piece in the issue. And then Tulsa Geological Society is also waving the flag and giving support to this. So just want to thank everybody. And then there are a long list of other entities, but we will go to those later. But just thank you. We're recording this. You'll get an email with a link to the uploaded recording. It will be on YouTube. I will need to process it a bit, so it will be in the next couple of days. But thanks again. And any final thoughts? Well, thank you. And
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for
oh,
leading
Yes,
this.
thank you all.
Bye.
Great
Bye,
work.
everyone.
Thanks now.
thank you.
Bye-bye.